Hey there, everybody. So we're going to look at Chapter 11, the Americas, from about 2500 BCE to 1500 CE. It's about 4,000 years. We're going to look about a 4,000 year period here. And we will start. In case anyone's writing that down, I'll give you just a second. We will start with the first peoples of the Americas, describing the Americas and their people. The Americas are as varied as any place on Earth. We have deserts to lush jungles to mountains, river valleys to the coldest places on Earth. That is everything. Um, so geographically, climatologically, it is as varied as anywhere else. Um, One of the most interesting aspects of early American societies is that each one was unique, and each one typically developed based upon the geography and the climate of the region. American societies and civilizations developed independently from the Old World. They were behind the Old World in most ways, technologically, but they still developed, they still advanced. They developed farming and cities and social structures and everything that every other part of the world does. They just do it a little bit later, generally. Well, some cases thousands of years later. But they still develop it all. They still develop pretty much everything everyone else does, just at a slower pace. A letter sent to the Medici rulers, who were a family that ruled cities in Italy, wealthy, powerful family, going all the way back to the beginning of the Renaissance. The letter was by a man named Amerigo Vespucci. He described a new world. This happened in 1497. He drew a map. This new world that he described specifically to the Medicis was what we today call Venezuela. The letter was then published, numerous languages, and then there was a further map drawn out based upon stories from several explorers, including Columbus. And this land of Venezuela and the surrounding areas starts to be known as America, which is what that translates to as the land of Amerigo, Amerigo's place of Amerigo. Therefore, that's why we live in America. He's really the one to first create the first map of America, even though it isn't like all of North and Central and South America. It's of a big enough piece that furthermore, when they start drawing more maps and bigger maps, more detailed and accurate, because his maps weren't very accurate, of course, it simply took on a life of its own, and all of this became known as Amerigo, the land of Amerigo. That's why we live in North America and South America below us, as opposed to North Columbia and South Columbia. I'm sure Columbus would have much preferred it be named after him. Christopher Columbus, he set sail from Spain, paid for by the king and queen of Spain and Portugal, Ferdinand and Isabella. He set sail 1492. He actually makes several voyages to America. He makes at least three, I think. Maybe more, but at least three different voyages. He was looking for a western route to India, in large part because of the Crusades. All the information and knowledge and spices and food and all the things that came about due to those increased connections between East and West during the 11, 12, 1300s. And then a lot of that was cut off with the end of the Crusades and with the continuing rivalry between Muslims and Christians. The Europeans had to find another way, and they start these voyages of exploration around the globe. And so Columbus is looking for a western route to India and China, or what they called at the time the Indies. Well, on his way sailing westward, he ran into the Americas, which was not on any European map, and did not exist until Columbus discovers it. Technically, the Vikings came here first, but there's no real record. They didn't write anything down. There's no maps made. And they only really showed up in one small period around the year 1000 something and then just disappeared. Who knows what happened to them? So effectively, even though technically the Vikings were first, effectively it's Columbus who really discovers us. And therefore, when he finds the Indians, he actually lands in like the Bahamas region of the Caribbean, Central or Latin America, Central America. I guess we call it Central America or the Caribbean. And of course, he meets these native tribal people who he calls them Indians, thinking it is India. Even to the end of his life, even to his death, he still was never convinced that he hadn't discovered India. Nonetheless, eventually we realized this is not India, this is not China. It is a whole nother part of the world. And they had already determined the Indies was India and China. So that becomes the East Indies, and the Caribbean becomes the West Indies. You'll hear those terms. West Indies is Caribbean, Americas, East Indies is Southeast Asia. He identifies the population as Indians, and we call this the West Indies. Today, what we call Central America, or even sometimes you'll hear the term Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica for Central America, right here. I just told you all that, so you're good with that. All right. So archaeological and DNA evidence shows that the first humans actually crossed the Bering Strait land bridge probably around 15,000 years ago. However, we do know there is some evidence, some very current evidence, that indicates that possibly 10 or 20,000 years earlier. We'll come backtrack for just a second. So we have the Bering Strait land bridge up here, which connects North America with Asia. And the way they're able to do that is because it's frozen. We're in a little ice age 15,000 years ago. And we have ice caps frozen across the northern part of the world. In the United States, we have ice caps all the way down to like Missouri. Solid ice glaciers all the way down to the central United States, what becomes central United States. All that recedes later, but because it's frozen, they're able to simply walk across the frozen water and they colonize North America and South America eventually. So the Indians that do actually colonize America are from China or from Asia. Sorry, this is long before China, from Asia. We do now believe that probably some Native Americans, probably some Asian populations actually made it to South America earlier than this. You don't see it on the map here, of course, but the Pacific Ocean here is full of literally thousands of islands, small islands. And by 1492, a lot of them are populated by small tribes and small groups of people, numbering in the hundreds and thousands. We think it's actually very possible that over, 500,000 years, Native Americans or Asian peoples, actually humans, I guess is the best way to say, hopscotched across the Pacific, island to island, island to island, over thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of years, and might have actually made their way to South America long before the 15,000 year ago mark. That is still debated, but we're going to go with the standard right now because that is still hotly debated. Of the 15,000 year ago mark, they walked across Bering Strait and then they started to populate all the Americas over the next several thousand years. That one we're still holding on to because the evidence for the island hopping across the Pacific is not conclusive yet, although it's certainly possible. Humans had been in Asia for almost 500,000 years, Homo sapiens, modern humans. So it's certainly conceivable that they did indeed island hop across the Pacific over 500,000 year period and eventually actually run into South America. Certainly possible. That's that right there I just talked about. What were early humans? Hunters and gatherers. More appropriately, probably gatherer hunters. We actually think humans, we've always used to think they mostly hunted and they gathered fruits and vegetables and plants and dead animals and whatnot. But we think now it's actually humans were actually more likely. Most of their calories probably came from gathering and scavenging, basically scavenging dead bodies, dead animals. Uh, very, very risky. I mean, you got to consider it's a very tenuous life in this time period. Very low population, small groups, small tribes. To go out and risk your life on a daily basis, killing large mammals that are several times bigger than you and far deadlier, actually is sort of illogical. Especially when the food that you can just gather around. I mean, there's not like there's no, there's hardly any population, so you can simply pick fruits and nuts and berries and plants and find all kinds of sea life. We do know most early humans stayed near water, ocean or freshwater, where there's a plethora of life, just a ton of different sea life that you can find easily, much more easily acceptable than trying to take down a large mammal, which could crush you to death or gore you to death with its horns. So we actually think hunting was probably a much smaller percentage of early human life than we actually thought, years ago. They often would follow migrating animal herds, looking for the sick, the injured, the dead. We do know they had tactics of like scaring herd animals over cliffs, and then they would simply fall down. Dozens would die, crash to the bottom, and then humans would simply go and gather up the bodies, and they would feast. Um, yeah. This again is still debated, but the scientific the scientific evidence seems to be leaning a lot more towards humans were actually more gatherers than hunters. We used to think that all of the large mammals in North America died out as a result of human killing them, because North America used to be full of many large animals. Giant saber-toothed tigers. There was a beaver that was like 6 feet long. All kinds of other animals. Of course, giant woolly mammoths. There were horses. All those died out. Every one of those. The horses that we have here are actually brought from Europe after Columbus. Humans actually killed and ate them as animals to eat. They didn't use them to ride around on. We actually believe humans contributed to that, but probably more likely this ice age actually did it. This ice age, which lasted a couple thousand years, probably killed off a lot of those animals. The smaller animals simply died of the freezing conditions, and then the bigger animals, of course, starved because the bigger animals eat the smaller animals, or vegetation. The big animals that are vegetarians eat the plants. Well, all the plants died because it was frozen. So we actually think that probably the biggest reason for the mass die off of large animals in North America, wasn't humans. It was simply the Ice Age. Although humans probably contributed to it as well. It's very interesting. All of this is still controversial, simply because there's so little evidence, so little evidence because they had no writing, they had no language. So the only record we have is really archaeological or geologic remains. Um, it's tough. It's tough. It's guesswork, but I mean it's educated guesswork, but a lot of it is still sort of guesswork or theory. Excursion night here. This is sort of we see Asia back here, the frozen Bering Land Bridge, where they came across, and eventually colonizing all the Americas, taking taking probably 5,000 years at least to colonize from North America all the way to South America. Maybe a 5,000 year period to actually get all the way down to the tip of South America, close to it. 4 or 5 thousand years. They almost always stayed near water. Why? I've already alluded to that a little bit. So, think about that. Why water? Why did almost all early human civilizations gravitate to water? That applies back in the old world too. Mesopotamia, China, India, the Greeks, the Egyptians. I mean, it was always the same. Humans are humans. It's in our genetics, I guess. So why do they always stay near the water? Fresh water or salt water or both? Several reasons. Several reasons. I can think of one, two, three, four off the top of my head. Just right there. There's at least four reasons I can think of off the top of my head why. So think about that. I've told you all of these before in the preceding chapters. We talked about all the different reasons. Furthermore, I'm going to add another element to this. How did staying near water actually affect the growth of human populations? So we know why they stayed near the water for the several reasons, which you should pretty much be aware of. You can always look in your book too if you have questions about that. But how did it actually affect the growth of human populations? Did it expand it? Did it quicken it? Did it slow it down? Think about that. And there's a couple elements to that too, between freshwater, seawater, the uses of water. Uh, yeah, I don't want to say anything more, but think about that. There's a lot of reasons why how water also affected the growth of the human populations. Okay, move to the next one. The development of agriculture. There's a good piece of what we were just talking about. The development of agriculture, 5 to 6,000 BCE, we see agriculture develop in the Americas, entirely independent of the Old World. On average, we're talking about 4,000 years here after agriculture is developed in the ancient world. Entirely independent. Which implies take a group of humans of this level of evolution and put them anywhere, and agriculture would have occurred. It's simply the natural evolution of the human species. We would have developed it. It develops independently in multiple places around the world, entirely unconnected. Humans simply all did this, generally speaking, within about a 5,000 year period. That says a lot about how humans developed and how humans will continue to develop forward even without any outside influences. Lots of native crops, maize, which is corn, chilies, beans, avocado, squash, manioc. Manioc's like a big root, big like a tuber, like a big root. I've never had it myself, but I've seen them in the grocery stores. Maize was very important. Matter of fact, some religious beliefs among Native Americans actually uses maize as part of a creation story. To actually, their people actually arose out of corn. Talk about children of the corn, right? That really indicates how important it was to their way of life. If their actual creation myth is that their entire human population arose from corn, that must mean corn is incredibly important to them. Has a religious, a symbolic meaning, maybe even been used as currency. There's even some evidence corn may have been used as a type of currency. Not unusual. In Africa, seashells were used as currency. India as well. So use what you got, I guess. There's beliefs and ideas of a corn god in several different societies, of actual deities associated with corn. From about 8,000 to about 1,500 BCE, it spreads all through the Americas. So from about 8,000 BCE to 1,500 BCE, we see agriculture spread from North, Central to South America. And of course, after 1500 CE, that is the time of Columbus, we actually see some of these crops make their way to Europe and Asia, where they didn't exist. We see a big cross-Atlantic and cross-Pacific trade of goods, and we see plants and animals that were in America show up in Europe and Asia, and vice versa. We see plants and animals that didn't exist in America be brought into America. Horses, for instance, didn't exist in America. They were bought from the Europeans. Potatoes in some places were just important. Manioc is it's sort of like a potato. I believe this is it right here. It's a root that usually grows in jungle areas. Some other cultures treated manioc like some treated corn, as though life actually sprung out of manioc. That's how significant it was to their culture. Corn can be cultivated in milpas. This is one of the early agricultural techniques, which is so successful. In essence, this is it's a symbiotic relationship. We really have beans, which are vines. Beans require vines. They require something to vine on and grow on. So they actually have corn stalks growing in one spot, and they would actually plant beans around it. And the beans would then vine around the corn stalks. So you would have that. And so you'd have the same exact square foot providing multiple types of foods. And they grew well together. And we actually see extensions of this where they actually combine multiple types of foods in the same exact plots of land. The only reason it worked had to be trial and error because there's no way they would have known this. Or they simply saw it out in nature. And they saw it growing that way in nature because that's where all of our crops come from. They were originally naturally occurring and we domesticated them, used them for ourselves. The only reason it worked is obviously the beans must pull different nutrients from the soil than the corn. Because if they both focused and pulled the same exact nutrients for growth from the soil wouldn't be able to support both. So it was simply a great relationship. Another agricultural technique is chinampas. These are floating islands of soil. The Americas are very wet. Even though we do have deserts here, generally speaking, North, Central, and South America are some of the wettest places on Earth. There's places in North America that have the same rainforest, they get the same water. Same again. There's some places in North America, in the United States, they get the same amount of rain, precipitation as a rainforest. So we have a lot of water in the Americas, generally speaking. So as a result of this, with so much water, they found it difficult to grow crops in some places because it was simply too water, too wet, too swampy. So they actually built islands of land. They build frames out of probably wood, trees or whatever, and then they would actually fill them up with dirt, and it would dry out and actually make cropland, farmland on these floating islands that would actually float out in the middle of lakes. Some of them were big. Some of them were like the size of farms that actually floated out in the middle of lakes. Because there was so much water, they couldn't grow crops on the land because it was too wet, too moist, too damp. Everything would like rot. So they had to put them out on the lakes on this land so it would dry out. It was really interesting how they, like, where do they develop that idea? This doesn't develop anywhere else in the world like this. It's really unique. Um, Potatoes were raised on terraced slopes. You see an example right here of a terraced slope. This is very common in South America. Chile, the Andean mountains, they build these because it was a mountainside like this here, just a straight down mountainside. You can't build on that. You can't even walk on it. You can't grow on that. Everything would just fall off or roll down, including water. Any water you tried to use to water crops would simply roll downhill. So what they did is they built these man-made terraces so they could actually grow crops and farmland on the sides of the hills and the mountains. Very unique, very smart. Lots of unique stuff develops in the Americas, different than the rest of the world. How about dogs? Dogs are domesticated, give or take. I don't know. Generally speaking, we think dogs start to be domesticated about 15,000 years ago, approximately. So around 15 to 20,000 years ago, dogs were still wolves. And then we started associating with them, and eventually we domesticate them. So it's really debatable. We think that these humans in America did not actually bring domesticated dogs with them. That they probably domesticated the wolves that already existed here and started using them as protection to hunt with, for defense, stuff like that. You have llamas and alpacas, and there were no. I don't believe we had cows here. I don't think there were even pigs. I think all of those are brought from Europe. Um, Things like that. However, because we didn't have any real pack animals exactly, or I guess the better words, we didn't have draft animals. They didn't have ox, they didn't have like horses, they didn't have like cows or bulls. So they didn't have those types of things to like pull plows and whatnot. So almost everything, especially in South America, everything was manpower. Everything was done by humans. Humans carried everything. Humans did all the labor in the fields. There really wasn't animals used for that. Llamas and alpacas really aren't designed for pulling plows or stuff like that. So it's interesting. Just how it's unique. We see how many different cultures and societies we're going to talk about soon developed entirely uniquely in North and South America, different than anywhere else in the world. Different farming technologies, different animal domestication technologies that develop unique from anywhere other place. Almost any type of technology or learning or farming technique in the old world, you can find evidence of both. You can find evidence of it in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Here in the Americas, because we're entirely disconnected, literally hundreds of thousands of years disconnected, it's all different. All kinds of interesting stuff here. All right, Let's talk about some of these cultures. Put this up here. There we go. Mounds, towns, and trade in North and South America. The growth in population due to increased crop cultivation. So the more plants and crops that are being grown, the farming techniques really cause population to expand dramatically. We do start seeing small urban societies develop by about 2500 BCE. Around the same time it's happening in the old world. It just happens slower here, significantly slower. So we see that we think we see the very first towns and villages starting to develop by 2500. But it isn't really till 1500 that we actually start seeing what we might start calling civilization. Really, any type of advanced culture beyond simply a large village. And advanced civilizations require advanced governmental techniques. They have to have communications of some sort. They have to have some type of military. They have to have usually we say they have to have some type of writing or language. We don't often find all those things in American civilizations. We still call them that though, because they're still certainly advanced civilizations. They just don't always match up cleanly with what we think of as old world civilizations. Um, but we still call them this, and we still consider them this. They're just slower and behind the rest of the world, and there's reason for that very clearly. Much smaller population, a lot fewer people with ideas, and much fewer different interactions. We know that interactions among different groups of people is probably one of the most significant reasons for advancement in different technologies. They didn't have a lot of that here. They were very small, very limited, and very secluded, low population. So their opportunities for cross-cultural interaction were very limited, as opposed to the old world had, hundreds of millions of people. It was much more significant, that type of interaction. In North America, typically those around the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. This is what is basically central, what becomes the United States, central United States. They constructed earthworks, for instance. They were often referred to as mound builders. They built these earthworks, literally these mounds. Um, why? We're not sure. Again, there's no writing. There's no language. We don't have any idea. But we believe. They often built these things. We think they were used for defense. They might build towns or villages on top for defense, obviously a higher position. We also know many of these mounds were empty. So they were used as burial grounds, probably had a religious significance, something like that. And we also know many of these mounds were actually in shapes of animals, but huge. In other words, shapes of animals that if you're on the ground, all you would see is a mound of dirt or grass. You wouldn't see it. The only way you'd actually see the animals is from the sky, way up in the sky, which indicates very clearly that these animal shapes and different figurations that were made, sometimes there's geometric patterns like pyramids, stuff like this. Very obviously, the reason this was done was for the gods. This had to be appealing to the spirits in the sky. There's no reason. They're the only ones, these spirits in the sky, these gods are the only ones who could see the actual shapes on the ground. Humans only see a wall of dirt. So it's obvious. They had religious but political purposes, military purposes. They were often referred to as mound builders in the central, what becomes the United States. And they really they thrived around probably the year 1000 to 1500, and then died out shortly afterwards. Actually, this advanced civilization in North America went away before the Europeans arrived, right before they arrived, within just a century or two before the Europeans got there. They pretty much collapsed. We're not sure why. Ecological destruction, maybe. We're not sure. In the region of Peru, this is in South America, known as Norte Chico, we see pyramids being built as high as 10 stories high, comparable to sort of like the ancient stepped pyramids of early Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Same exact kind of stuff. And we have no doubt these were religious purposes. In essence, to get them closer to the gods, closer to the gods in the sky. All human life, all early humans had some notion of gods and spirituality and spirits and the other world, another unseen world. Everybody had this. We know that this region in South America benefited from agricultural irrigation technology, which provided plants like squash and beans, crops like squash and beans, and lots of others. The largest city, and I don't have it on I don't have it on the slide here. Largest city in Norte Chico was known as Caral, Caral, Caral. That's what we call it anyway. This was the largest city in Norte Chico, built of stone. They had temples. We know it was a major center of production and trade. It was an advanced civilization. It also fell apart before Europeans got here. Probably for the same reason civilizations fall apart back in the old world. Uh, Warfare, climate change, ecological change, population growth. These urban environments with large population growth would have been very susceptible to disease spread, things like this. And a virulent disease mutation could wipe out half the population that they had no immunity to, especially if they were actually having some type of trade and communications with like Pacific Islanders, where they might have been separated from for thousands of years, and suddenly just a boat shows up. That's what happened to the Europeans showed up. When the Europeans showed up, they brought disease. All they had to do was breathe on the Indians. They breathed on Native Americans, and they wiped out 90% of the population. 95% of Native Americans died simply by the Europeans being here, not lifting a sword, just breathing on them. Which could have been the same thing from the east or from the west. Someone from Asia could have shown up, sailed up on a skin boat, boom, 5,000 year separation, and some disease or infection spreads to the entire population, killing half the people. I mean, there's any number of things that could have happened. Ecological disaster seems to be the most common theory, but there could have been anything, any number of things could have happened. But point being, before Europeans got here, just about every Native American culture has collapsed, with a couple of exceptions, like the Aztecs, for instance. But almost all of them have actually had a high point and then fallen before the Europeans got here. And when the Europeans show up, generally speaking, with the exception of maybe the Aztecs and the Incans, everywhere else they show up, they see a very backward people that are, in essence, living in the Stone Age. Even though at one point in the past, almost all of them had actually been more advanced and then had fallen for some variety of reasons. The Olmecs, I think now we're looking at Central America here, the Olmecs, Central America. The Olmecs developed a thriving culture somewhere in the 1500 BC to 300 BC, so over a 1,000-year period. These are probably the first cities in Mesoamerica, Central America. They cultivated maize and squash, other types of produce. All across Mesoamerica, we know they traded cacao, various products like pottery and figurines, jade. Jade seems to be their most prized product. Jade is so common in Central America that even when the Europeans arrived, you could simply walk around and find rocks of jade just laying on the ground. And this is after Native Americans have been there for thousands of years making jade tools, weapons, ornaments, religious figures, bowls, pottery. Jade was a prized possession. Rubber, jaguar pelts, obsidian, that's volcanic glass, sharp as a razor blade. All of these things, naturally occurring, none of them require almost any actual production. Some do. Rubber requires production. Obviously, a jaguar pelt has to be cured and stuff like that. And this jade requires artistry. But the production is still pretty basic. Pretty basic production still. We also believe Olmec society wasn't based on class distinction. We think most of them live in small villages, only a handful of cities, and the cities probably only had the elite, the upper class, living in them. Most of the population lived in very rural, egalitarian, meaning very equal, very fair societies. We think there might have been a priest class. There might have been a separate priest and ruler class. But the majority of the population were poor farmers, common farmers. Large water reservoirs, they had sewage systems. They had sewer systems. In 1500, the year 1500 of Columbus, that 1500, there's a lot of places in the old world that didn't have sewer systems. They had sewage systems, running water, stuff like that. Very advanced in many ways. And yes, this is me sitting here next to this giant stone Olmec head. No, it's actually not. Although from a distance, it does look like me. I could see myself dressed exactly like that. Matter of fact, I dress like that a lot. Yeah, the whole Hawaiian shirt, the khaki. Oh yeah, the hat. I like the hat too. He's rocking. The religious structures. There was a great pyramid, very much like a Sumerian ziggurat. This was built on a small island. We believe it was a center of the Olmec religion. It was huge stone slabs were used to create a 110-foot high pyramid, the largest structure built in the Americas before humans arrived. That's stupid. Before Europeans arrived. No humans. How the hell are you building a pyramid? It has to be the space gods or something like that, right? Um, Probably to gain closeness with the gods, as every other culture's done. Every other culture's built something like this. The Romans, the Greeks, Indians, the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Chinese, they've all done it. They've all built some type of structure to somehow get them closer to commune with the gods. We do know we feel very confident they did human sacrifices. Uh, Human sacrifices were thought to probably appease the gods, and you would usually sacrifice your enemies. We also, there's some evidence because some of these cultures, it's in Mesoamerica, do actually have some writing. We really have no writing left from North America. Those Native American cultures really never developed writing or didn't survive. But Mesoamerica actually has writing and language and written culture that we have some surviving from. The Mayans, the Olmecs, the Aztecs, we have written remainders of actual history from those cultures to some degree. Um, we know from that it is apparent that some people volunteered to be sacrificed, believing they were then helping out the community. By their sacrifice, they were appeasing the gods. Uh, for instance, they would the idea that the blood would actually transfer into water. The blood of the sacrifice, of the human sacrifice, would somehow translate into water for the crops, rain for the crops from the sky, from the gods. Anyway, to cure a drought, for instance, stuff like that. Several Central American societies did human sacrifices. The Olmecs and the Aztecs, and maybe even the Mayans. Apparently, it was sort of a traditional sociocultural thing for Mesoamerica. They had the most advanced societies in the Americas, was Mesoamerica. Not surprising. Where were the most advanced societies in the ancient world? In the middle, in the crossroads of the ancient world, in the middle, not on the fringe of Asia, not on the fringe of Europe, not on the fringe of Africa. The most advanced societies in the old world were in the middle. Mesopotamia, the Greeks, the Egyptians, because they were at the crossroads of different cultures and different technologies. Same thing here. Mesoamerica was at the crossroads of North and South America. Therefore, logically, it would make sense that they are the most advanced societies with the best technology and the most civilization, the most building technology, etc. And they were not surprising at all. It makes perfect sense. Um, Probably the reason they're also the only ones to have actually developed writing and recorded language of some sort. Not surprising. The Olmec heads, we don't know what they were. It's still unclear. There's lots of these. They range from small all the way to gargantuan. Um, we don't know. We assume they were maybe the heads of gods, maybe the heads of kings, but we're not sure what these heads are all over Mesoamerica. You can find lots of them in all the areas of the Olmecs. We're not sure why, but we think probably had something to do with either they were a way of worshiping the gods or their kings. We also know they developed a calendar of about 360 days. Damn close. They developed a calendar and actually broke out the year into, I forget what it was, the actual time. I don't think it was 12 months. But they did actually break up the year into different parts, different periods of the year. And they did develop a calendar based on about 360 days. Pretty good for having no actual science or technology. They were really close. This tells you where the Olmecs developed here. This leads up into Mexico here. Just gives you an idea where it is. Their culture thrived for about 1,200 years, very successful, very advanced. And in truth, given the time period here, in many ways, they were almost as advanced as cultures back in the old world. Very similar. Their advancements were pretty stupendous, to be honest. Especially developing entirely independent from almost any other part of the world, just the Americans. This is an Inca quipu. We don't have writing left over from the Incans. We're not sure they had writing and language exactly, but we have these cloth strings. We believe this was, well, we think this could have been used as a number system or a writing system of some sort. In other words, the length of the string and the color of the string would be like different language or letters or numbers. So a string of a particular length with a particular color and a particular number of knots would represent a word or a letter or a number. And then the next string will be a different length, different color, different number of knots, and that would represent a different. So this right here could be like an essay paper. I mean, sort of. This would be their language or their number system. I've actually seen both. That it might have been language, it might have been numbers, it might have been a combination. But this was their system of communication. Strings and knots and different colors of the strings and knots. Just unique, just different, just a different. But this was their form of communication. This was their language. This was their written language, if you want to call it that. Really interesting. Um, Different. Oh, there's also thicknesses. So it's not only knots, length, color. It's also the thickness of the different strings. I guess maybe they're made of different materials, maybe to have different thicknesses. And even another factor, position. There's actually positions of how the strings and the knots are attached together, and also how they're actually knotted together in groups. You can see where there's actually groups of strings actually put together in different colors. Those could all be different. I mean, this could be an entire history of their culture. But I don't believe we've ever decoded this. I don't believe any. I don't believe there's any. I don't think this has ever been decoded. We feel very confident it is what we think it is. And don't get me wrong, I haven't studied this personally, but the people who study it believe confident it is something like what we think, this language or number system. But I don't believe it's ever been decoded. They used cotton. This was in the Peru area, pre Peru, I guess before it was Peru. This was the Incan culture. The material here is cotton that's being used. Cotton had been used for a very long period of time. It's also very durable. Cotton lasts a long time. We actually have found samples of cotton from 1,000 years ago, buried in grave goods in other parts of the world. That is still it's still together. It isn't just crumbled into dust. It's actually still sort of a material weave after 1,000 years. Think about how it was in other cultures. What did they use in other cultures that was so durable that could last forever? One of the reasons we have a lot of knowledge from other cultures. I mean, the first one, of course, should come immediately to mind, stone. One of the reasons we know so much about early cultures in the old world is because so much of things were written down or carved into stone. Well, wood bark also lasts a long time. Bamboo, ivory, bones. This was something that was very long lasting, very durable, lasted very durable. So it makes a lot of sense. This was their most complex way of transmitting information, whether it's language or whether it was whether it's language, math, or combination. For all we know, this could be a list of how many cows a person owns or someone's entire net worth. We don't really know. Well, the reason it might have been needed was because Inca was a massive empire. The Incans had an empire that went over 350,000 square miles and might have had as many as 16 million people. The largest empire in the Americas, probably, because of its size. The Aztecs might have been technically more powerful. Don't get me wrong, the Incans and the Aztecs didn't really have anything to do with each other. But the Aztecs might have been more powerful, possibly, As far as actual militarily powerful, maybe, but probably, at least in South America, this was the most advanced civilization, Incans. Incans. Really interesting stuff. This could have to do with taxes. It could be tax collection. It could be simply a list of goods and products. We know they built large scale irrigation projects. They built roads. They built bridges. They had to. They lived in the mountains. Almost the entire civilization was in the mountains, the high mountains, over something like over 8 or 10,000 feet, where most people in the world did not even live. You could live there. I mean, people live there, but your entire body chemistry has to adjust to the elevation of living a couple miles up in the sky. Uh, they were the most advanced high level elevation civilization ever in the world before modern times. Yeah, really, really complex, really advanced. And this Kipu might have been very significant in running their entire civilization. Pretty cool. If only we knew exactly what it was and what it said and did. All right, classical era Mesoamerica. Now we are in modern times. All that we were just talking about was pretty much BCE, as by the dates, BCE, over 2,000 years ago. Now we are in more modern times, 300 or 900 CE. So this is 1700 to 1,000 years ago. Probably during 300 to 900, the most advanced civilization in the Americas was the Mayas, probably the Mayans. Large cities in Central and Northern America. Mayan agriculture and trade. The Maya culture was based on agriculture, specifically maize. It's in the Yucatan Peninsula and Mesoamerica, based on maize, beans, squash, fruit trees, large agricultural development. We still have many Mayan pyramids that are historical attractions in, like, Mexico, for instance, Central America. You can go down there and visit those pyramids. Big tourist attractions. Their large agricultural production. They had a population probably several million. Mayans probably had several million population. They had a unified language and a culture. Uh, Big successful civilization. Their entire culture was based on agriculture. Everything was based on agriculture. Tikal was probably the largest Mayan city. Tikal, Tikal. May have had as many as 40,000 people. Religious structure. Maya science and religion. The Maya developed probably the most complex writing system of any American society. They recorded births, deaths, important events, marriages, astronomical observations. They did this on a variety of substances: tree bark, stone, deer skin, pottery. Yeah, there's probably more writing that exists from the Mayas than more than all the other American civilizations combined. Uh, Pretty advanced stuff. They created calendars. I don't know if any of you are, well, you're old enough. Some of you may remember that there was this weird urban legend, or whatever the hell you want to call it, that the world was going to end back in 2012, because that's where the Mayan calendar ended, was in 2012. There were even movies made about it. End of the world, 2012. Mayans were geniuses. Okay, whatever. The reason the Mayan calendars ended in 2012 was because when the Europeans arrived, the Spanish, I think it was the Spanish, they saw all this. The belief is, we believe, that they saw all this advanced culture and society, and they wanted it all destroyed. So they burned everything. They burned everything, destroyed everything, tore down monuments. They actually chiseled out writings. They did everything they could to basically wipe out the Mayan culture completely, because it both challenged Christian theology while also challenged the European ideal that there was actually that the Native Americans were all savages, uncivilized. When you actually see the Mayan culture, it actually portrays them as civilized, as civilization, having knowledge and math and science and learning. And yet that entirely contradicts the European message that was being sent to other Europeans and other white people that everybody in the Americas were basically savages. And again, the contradictions with Christian theology. So the Spanish, the conquistadors, they were destroying everything. They were burning everything, obliterating it all. And a handful of books survived. A handful of writings survived. And those writings just happened to go to 2012. We think their calendar probably went way beyond that. It just all got destroyed. That's the general going theory of why it actually ends in 2012. The Europeans destroyed everything else, and someone just happened to be someone who thought it was important. And we think, interestingly enough, we actually think it might have been Catholic priests that actually saved some of this. Um, some Catholic priests didn't agree with this destruction and actually saved some of these writings. They were pretty much the only educated people at the time, so we can thank them for much of what we have left of the Mayan actual written parts on deer skin and bark, which would have been simply burned up. Very interesting. One of these writings was a book of mythological narratives that survived the Spanish attempts to destroy all records in the 1500s. We think the Spanish probably destroyed 80 to 90% of all Mayan written records. Thanks. Nonetheless, we do have enough things left to tell us that they were a very advanced civilization, as advanced as any ancient civilization was before modern times, really. The Popol Vuh provides a view of Mayan interpretation of world creation, concepts of good and evil, religious rituals, records of their society. It is very comparable to like Hindu writings that are not purely religious. Many like the Bhagavad Gita, something like this, is very comparable to this. These writings that are sort of socio-cultural, moral, religious, they sort of blend everything together. And Hindu is really that. Hindu is not specifically a religion or just a religion. Hindu is actually a cultural, societal way of life. It is their culture, it's their society. It's far more than just religion. We think that the religious beliefs of the Mayans was similar. Their entire worldview, their culture, their science, their politics, their religious beliefs were all wrapped up together into their mythology. We think. Very interesting. Good and evil and gods and heroes. Kind of interesting stuff. My religious festivals and religious rituals are performed with a specific calendar, and they got much better than the Olmecs did. They actually got to exactly 365 days, only off by 6 hours. Damn good. 365 days. They also did human sacrifice, although it didn't seem like they did as much. We do know they did do human sacrifice, especially of enemies. General human sacrifice seems to be of enemies, and the Mayans did fight a lot of wars. It seems they were very warlike, as all these cultures were in Mesoamerica. Mayans, Olmecs, and Aztecs were all very warlike. They all had slaves. We think Olmecs did. We think Olmecs had slaves as well. So they all had slaves. We think mathematics was based on the number 20. Our mathematics system, of course, is based on the number 10. It's the decimal system. Our mathematics system that we use today is based on the number 10. Theirs is based on 20. They're also one of the very first early human civilizations. There's several in Europe. There's several in the old world that still don't have this. The concept of zero. Zero is a concept that is required for advanced mathematics. You simply cannot have advanced mathematics without a concept of zero. Um, I'm not a mathematician. Don't ask me why that is, but it's a fact. Advanced math requires a zero concept. They had that, which implies advanced mathematics and other things they did. There's several cultures in the ancient world, the old world, back in Europe, Asia, Africa, that still, by this time period, have not developed the concept of zero. Today, of course, makes total sense, right? I mean, you learn that from a young age, but back then, this was an interesting thing. Um, Very few societies ever really used or understood the idea of zero. I mean, again, how do you have a concept of nothing? That's what zero is, right? Zero is nothing. So you have to create a concept of nothingness. You could see how that would be actually difficult for a lot of cultures to wrap their head around. How do you define zero? It is nothing. How do you define nothing? Exactly. I just think it's just interesting. Books have been written about this, by the way. You could look them up. Entire books have been written just about the idea of zero. Mathematical system improved their system of astronomy, the development of the calendar, making them the American masters of math and science before the Europeans arrived. And the Europeans arrived and quickly destroyed everything. Everything they found that in any way contradicted European ideals of American savages, lack of civilization, the lack of culture, the lack of technology and religion, all of it either contradicted their entire ideology of what the American people would be, and what Columbus reported back, and the early explorers all reported back they were savages. Once they really got into the interior of the Americas, they start finding advanced cultures like the Aztecs and the Incans, with the remainder of the Incans, what's left over, sort of the twilight of the Incan Empire. They start seeing all this and they start realizing there is actually advanced cultures here, so they quickly destroy it. Everything they can. They burn and destroy the cities, everything they can. They burn it all down. That's actually their system here. They use a system of dots and lines to indicate numbers. Not uncommon with the Romans. Romans used letters and symbols to indicate numbers. They didn't use numbers like we do today. So was that a circle or a hole indicates zero, and then one dot is one, and then you get to six. It's a dot and a line, and you know, concept of 20 there is a dot and another hole, I guess. Really interesting. And I love the little cartoon here. I only had enough room to get a 2020. Ha! That'll freak somebody out someday. Really, if you can remember back to the 2012, a lot of people were there were people walking in the streets with signs, "End of the world" kind of shit. Whatever. Very interesting stuff. Growth and assimilation of Teotihuacan and Toltec cultures. Now we're going to be looking to Mexico now. Probably the most well-known of Mesoamerican cultures, Aztec, the Mexica, which are really the forerunners of modern Mexico. Um, so in southern and central Mexico, two groups of peoples arose around the same period of time with advanced societies and advanced cities. Teotihuacan peoples, this was the name of their culture as well as the name of their major city, their capital. We give it the same name. Their capital as well as their culture. This developed a large religious center that featured elaborate tombs and temples, and we actually think the city might have reached 200,000 population. It's huge. This is huge. In this time period, most cities in the old world don't even have 200,000 people. There's only a handful of cities in the world that over 200,000 folks in this time period. This was as advanced as any civilization we would see in Europe for the most part. The one thing they were missing, which is maybe the most important thing, that they did not have, that the old world had, was the one type of technology. And what was that? Think for a moment. Yep, that one. Military technology. They did not have the military technology. Technologically, they were almost as equal and almost comparable as most old world societies back in Europe, Asia, and Africa, most of them, but they didn't have the military technology, nor did they have the immunity to disease. Those two things spell destruction for pretty much all American cultures. The ones that were still around when the Europeans arrived. Some of these aren't not even around anymore. Again, Teotihuacan urban center goes away by 750. That's 750 years before Columbus. They had tombs, temples, 200,000 people, and at the time it was probably the fifth largest city in the entire world. The city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico was this had neighborhoods, it had tradesmen, tradespeople, all kinds of buildings and businesses. We know they had at least two different social classes, at least two social classes, with all the farmers, agricultural laborers living outside the city. So all the farmers living outside the city. We know there was a wealthy elite upper class. We also know they had the largest pyramids in the world. I mean, look at that. It's freaking massive. The largest pyramids on the globe, with the exception of one single pyramid in Egypt, which is bigger. That's it. Only one structure in the world by this time period bigger than this. One pyramid in Egypt. These were unbelievable creations, massive creations. We know they worship multiple gods. There were multiple different temples, probably built on top of this in wood, which are all gone. They had all these different temples. They had temples of the pyramids, temples of the sun and the moon, or temples of the sun and the moon, sorry. They social stratification. Somewhere around 750, the Teotihuacan was burned. Pretty much the city was burned down. The only thing remaining were the stone structures. The city was burned and depopulated. Over the next 300 years, we see the Toltec people come in, the Toltec Confederation. Maybe the most unified, but it was still weak, a very weak group. Toltecs extend their power all the way through Central America, and their capital city was known as Tula. And around 1174, they also collapsed. So the massive culture we're talking about here is Teotihuacan, and they collapsed around 750. The Toltecs arise immediately afterwards, sort of hold some of it together as a confederation of different tribes and cities, but nothing ever achieves the level of Teotihuacan, and their capital was Tula, and they only survive a couple hundred years, and then they also fall apart. By 1174, Tula falls, and Tula also is reclaimed by the jungle, which is what happens in most of these cases. Most of these towns and cities, the people simply leave, go back living out in the villages and the forests, and the cities are simply overgrown by the jungles and taken over by the plant and animal life. Well, interesting. Interesting stuff. 800 to 1174 there for the Toltecs. All right. Now we're going to switch gears and look at North America. Tula, Toltecs, Teotihuacan. And for anyone who's laughing at me for my pronunciation, that's okay. You go and laugh. Sorry, I'm not a Spanish speaker. I am saying it best I can. I apologize. I don't mean to be insulting if I am saying it wrong. Do the best I can with it. So, um, relatively small. On the scale, none of these civilizations have ever achieved the scale of the Incas. The Incas were several times bigger than any of these. In this Mesoamerica, the largest up to this point was the Mayans. The Mayans were the largest. We're not really going to talk about the Aztecs. You might wonder why. Because we're not going to talk about the Aztecs till we talk about when the Europeans arrive. Because the history of the Aztecs is heavily intertwined with the first Europeans. Spoiler alert, the Europeans obliterate them and destroy them. But before the Europeans arrived, right to the time the Europeans arrived, the Aztecs was a large, flourishing civilization with millions of people. Uh, and Europeans get here and screw it all up, as they do worldwide. So let's look at North America. I think this is actually the last thing we'll talk about. North America and the Hohokam, the Hopewell, the Mississippian societies, mound building societies. These are in North America. We see this is maybe the third different type of mound building society. That's simply a tradition in North American Native American culture. Why is not necessarily clear, because this doesn't really occur anywhere else in the world. Most cultures in the rest of the world don't build these false hills and mountains. Okay, the mountain is an exaggeration. Some of them are pretty big, but no, hills, we'll say. They don't build these false hills, really. Other cultures don't do this. It's kind of unusual. But we now see about three different cultures in North America that do something similar. Probably just all borrowing from the previous, because these mounds still exist. I mean, these are still historic sites. So it isn't like the old ones went away. So the new cultures, the new societies probably just copy the old ones. So it really only took one culture doing this for everyone else to want to do it, because they're very useful. Religious purposes, social purposes, military defensive purposes, religious purposes, lots of uses of these mounds. All these societies were class-based. We think they pretty much all had a king-priest class with a noble class, aristocratic class with them, and they're all peasant-based agricultural economies. And they all have a sort of a very slim middle class of like merchants and trade. Majority of people are poor farmers, a very slim middle class, and then a very much more slimmer elite upper class of kings, nobles, and priests. They all very similar. Um, really interesting about North American cultures. They all sort of mirror the previous ones because they all pretty much look like this. At least until Europeans get there, interesting enough, and all this is gone. Really weirdly ironic. North American cultures were hierarchical, class-based, hereditary, probably, upper class, middle class, lower class, with a religious class, a priest warrior class, a king, nobles, exactly like Europe. However, by the time the Europeans get here, all of this is gone. By the time Europeans actually arrive in North America, all of the North American culture that would be actually resemble European culture has collapsed. And pretty much all North American Indians are small tribal groups. Makes you wonder if Europeans had actually arrived hundreds of years earlier and actually seen an entire society in North America that really looked just like theirs back home, would things have been different? Now, the disease wouldn't have been different. Obviously, the disease would have still wiped out most of the population. But would we have treated Native Americans differently instead of the oppression and destruction which we rained down upon them? I don't know. Obviously, there's no way to know. But it's just weird. It's weird that they had cultures that looked very similar to European style, and they pretty much all collapsed just before the Europeans arrived, within a couple hundred years before Europeans get here. It's interesting. Um, they weren't as advanced, but still very similar. Very similar. Lots of crops. We mentioned before maize, beans, squash. Very similar diets to other places we've already talked about. So still, the culture is really based on agriculture. They all are. That's their society based on. Their trade is based on agriculture. The Hohokam peoples arose in generally what we think of as modern day Arizona. More commonly, you hear is referred to as the Pueblo Indians. That's a more common term you'd hear. Again, I'm from Texas. That's a current term you would have heard all the time, Pueblo Indians. Um, yeah, but there's lots of different groups. By the time the Europeans get here, there's probably over 300 Indian tribes in the Americas. Many of them are extinguished by the Europeans, either indirectly or directly. But there are probably over 300. A couple of these sometimes are referenced as the Indians of the West or the Indians of the Southwest. Anasazi, the Pueblo, the Hopi Indians. They used irrigation. They used terraced agriculture. Lots of mountains and hills in the West and Midwest. Lots of. Have you ever been across Arizona and areas like that? All those what are they called? Mesas? Is that what they're called? It'd be large flat land, and then basically it'd be like a big mountain or hill, and then it's all flat again, and they got these hills all over the place that are flat topped. These mesas, and so there's a lot of hill, a lot of mountains. They would build terrace. They had to irrigate. They made irrigation canals and waterways, artificial waterways, because such limited water availability. They had platforms and buildings for ceremonial events, religious events. They also had ball games. They probably learned that from the Mesoamericans, similar ball games to the Mesoamericans. I don't know if they were to the death necessarily. We see Anasazi, Pueblo, Hopi Indians. Mesa Verde might have been the largest town in the region during this period, a whopping 2,000 people, 2 or 3,000 people. That is how big. In this time period, you have cities in Mesoamerica in hundreds of thousands. Mesa Verde, 3,000 maybe. Much different culture, much smaller on a whole level of magnitude smaller, levels of magnitude smaller than what we see in Central America. And these civilizations probably had tens of maybe 100,000 people, maybe. And yet you have cultures in Mesoamerica with 10 million. Much different cultures. Trade was huge. Lots of trade of goods, agave, turquoise, cotton, maize, lots of trade. Trade was one of the a big source of I almost want to say revenue, but it wasn't revenue. These people didn't collect money like we think of as money today, or like Europeans think of as money. The trade would have been used to fill in all the gaps of things they didn't have. So they would trade away things they had extras of, like baskets, for instance, or agave or turquoise, for instance, or cotton, and they would trade in goods they didn't have, like fish and things like this from other cultures. So trade wasn't about generating revenue. Trade was about simply sustaining life. The Ohio River Valley, the Hopewell culture develops. This is in modern day Ohio, modern day Indiana, Illinois. So think that entire three-state stretch: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. Those are three states right there together. The Hopewell culture of this. They were also mound builders. We know the mounds were tombs for priests, leaders, other important officials. We know they built the animal-shaped mounds, the geometric-shaped mounds, probably for religious purposes, socio-cultural purposes, for the gods in the sky. Same kind of stuff we've seen for 1,000 years, over 1,000 years in North America. This mound building, which I've covered, I think, pretty well. Cahokia. This was the largest city in North America ever before the Europeans arrived, probably. Cahokia, I think, reached about. Interesting. My notes say 30 to 40,000 people. Off the top of my head, I remember it only being about 20,000. So anyway, we'll go with my notes, although I think that might be high. 20, 30,000 people at its height. This was the largest city. Again, one entire order of magnitude smaller, 1/10 of smaller than the largest cities in Mesoamerica. And even bigger. I mean, once you look at the Aztecs, and I think their capital is Tenochtitlan, which is what becomes Mexico City. That is a million population at one point before the Europeans destroy it, destroy the culture. So yeah, this is an advanced culture, but in the greater scheme of the American cultures, the least advanced part of North, Central, and South America was North America. Central and South America were far more advanced. If you think about the Olmecs, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Incans, all far more advanced than anything that ever develops in North America. Mesoamerica makes sense, and Inca might also make sense why Inca was so advanced before anyone else was. If you want to go with the alternative theory that humans actually arrived thousands of years earlier than we think, that would possibly explain why the Incan culture advanced civilization arose so much earlier than everyone else and was so much more advanced than everyone else in many ways, when pretty much all the rest of the Indians in North America were just living in small tribes and villages. It could explain why the Incans became so advanced quicker than everyone else, even though they were incredibly isolated. The Andes Mountains is one of the most isolated regions on the planet. The high Andes Mountains, it just seems really odd how they were so advanced when they were so isolated. It could be explained by the fact that humans might have actually been there for thousands of years, maybe even tens of thousands of years before anywhere else in the Americas. That might explain why they were so advanced. They had much, much longer to work on it. Maybe. That's just a theory. That's just a thought. But it could make some sense, potentially. Um, Cahokia was the largest city in North America, 30,000 people, we'll say, by around the year 1250. That's just 250 years before Columbus. By the time Europeans are surveying North America in the 1500s, Cahokia is long gone. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still remains left, there's still ruins left, although not a lot. But the actual population, the actual Mississippian culture is gone. They're all just a bunch of small tribes now, living effectively in the Stone Age. It's really interesting. This gives you an idea of one of those mounds. It's a snake, obviously. It's the tail, it's an entire snake. And if you're standing, these are roads, folks. If you were standing down here on the ground, it would literally, you just see a big wall of dirt and grass 6 feet high in front of you. You would have not the slightest clue that this was a snake, unless you were a god looking down on it from the sky. What's he swallowing? That makes it interesting. So, pardon me. The Hopewell culture did this. Um, hey, I'm back. Yeah, I could rewind and just redo that last thing, but why? I sort of like it because it's sort of like in a class. If I have a coughing fit in class, you all just gotta sit there and watch me have a coughing fit. They said to make you watch me do that for 2 minutes. Let's see. So the Great Serpent Mound here, Adams County, Ohio. Mississippians did this. The Hopo culture did this. Probably influenced by Mesoamericans. Probably. Mesoamericans, they didn't build mounds exactly, but they did do different types of earthworks. They did build different types of construction projects with dirt and bricks and rock and stone and stuff like this. So maybe they were influenced by them. We know they traded with them culturally. Culture, that's the wrong word. Economically, maybe? We know they traded goods. We know we can find obsidian in North America in multiple different places in North America. There is no obsidian in North America. Obsidian is volcanic glass. It doesn't occur in North America. So this obsidian, this shiny black volcanic glass, we see in Central America, South America. There's other evidence. That's just one, but there's lots of other evidence that indicates that the different American cultures, North, Central, and South, did not live in vacuums. They did trade with each other. They did communicate. They did trade ideas and goods. Um, Very interesting. Another reason we know this is maybe influenced by Mesoamerican culture or could be associated with it. Mesoamerican culture has this idea of this feathered serpent god, which is basically a snake with wings. Um, this is a snake. There's no wings, obviously, but it's a snake. So snake actually pops up in many cultures. We actually can see imagery of snakes in Indian culture, obviously Christian theology. We can see this in Mesopotamian culture. So the image of the snake there's been a lot of research been done on why snakes are so ubiquitous in early human cultures and religion. And many people have suggested that it's simply because snakes are dangerous as frack. People die from snake bites all the time. There's dozens and dozens of poisonous snakes in the world that simply kill you. Snakes are secretive, they hide in the ground, they surprise you, therefore they're sort of portrayed as evil, as monstrous. Um, they can change shape and size, they can shed their skin, which makes them almost seem like they're shape changing. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that snakes are simply a scary, scary thing for early humans, which probably killed many humans. Many people probably died of snake bites. Um, so, maybe snakes are just thought to be sort of primal, sort of part of the essence of the world, um, the supernatural, if you will. Who knows? Who really knows? That's the thing about a lot of ancient cultures. A lot of things we know, we have to have these educated guesses. And in many times, we actually base our knowledge on more modern cultures. Really? In case you're unaware, there's at least a half a dozen hunter-gatherer societies in the world today that still live in Stone Age technology. In Asia and Africa, South America, they are still living in what would be equivalent to Stone Age technology, using wood and bone and stone, and they are hunter-gatherers, living in jungles and grasslands in different places in the world. About a half dozen of them. They're very small. I mean, some of them literally have dozens of members. They're that small. Or living on little isolated islands. There's a couple places where they live on little islands there's a couple hundred people, and that's it. And they're basically living in a time bubble of thousands of years ago. They've ever advanced in any way. Um, so a lot of what we think of when we look at early cultures, we base it upon the evidence that we have available. But many times we actually look at modern versions of these early prehistoric societies, of which there's still a few in the world, and we sort of extrapolate. Is that true? Is it accurate? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe. Anyway, thanks for going through this with me, and we'll see you next time. That's it for the chapter. Peace.